Who was Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who transcended the boundaries of his humble origins to become Emperor of France? How did a Corsican artillery officer with a thick accent and a passion for strategy manage to shake the very foundations of Europe? And what drove him to achieve greatness, only to witness his empire crumble in the sands of time? Join us as we delve into the captivating journey of a man who rose from obscurity to become a legend, whose impact is still felt 2 centuries later.
Friends, be sure to subscribe to my Quiet History channel, and leave a comment of at least 7 words. This is necessary for the channel to function. Share this video with others if you think it's important. Thank you.
Napoleon Bonaparte was born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, a land that had recently been thrust under French control. Corsicans, proud and fiercely independent, were not eager to embrace their new rulers. They had only just fought for their own freedom under the leadership of Pascal Paoli, but now they found themselves silenced by the booming cannons of the French military. In a modest yet respected family of local nobility, young Napoleon would navigate these turbulent waters, dreaming of a future that seemed both distant and unattainable. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a man of ambition and intellect, managing to adapt to the new political reality while working within the French administration. He traveled to Paris, established connections, and even secured a position in the royal council. Yet, for many Corsicans, Carlo's alignment with the French was seen as betrayal, transforming him in their eyes from a son of the soil into a servant of an occupying regime. Despite this perception, Carlo had dreams of a brighter future for his children, which led to the momentous decision to send his eldest son, Napoleon, to study in France. From an early age, Napoleon was neither a Frenchman in spirit nor in language. At home, he spoke the Italian Corsican dialect, and his grasp of French was limited, marred by a thick accent. When he entered the military academy at the tender age of 9, he felt like an outsider. This son of a provincial noble family, often mocked for his worn boots and serious demeanor, struggled to fit in. His peers derided him, calling him the little Corsican and ridiculing his accent and mannerisms. Yet, instead of retaliating with words, he chose silence. Not out of fear, but because he was accumulating a quiet determination. While others played, he immersed himself in books. While others took vacations, he remained in the library, reflecting on his solitude and the coldness of his classmates. In his letters to his family, he expressed his loneliness, yet within him was forming a fierce resolve. He learned early on that nothing would be handed to him. He would have to seize his destiny. His admiration for figures like Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great fueled his ambition, leading him to adopt their strategies and emulate their boldness. This sense of purpose stirred within him, suggesting that he was not destined to be just another soldier, but a man with the potential to shape the course of history. At the age of 15, tragedy struck when his father passed away, leaving the family in financial disarray. Responsibility for his siblings fell heavily on his mother, Letizia, a woman of remarkable strength and willpower, who instilled in her children the harsh realities of the world. She taught them that life was cruel, and one must be prepared to fight for survival. From her, Napoleon inherited not only resilience, but also a profound sense of duty to his family. Even after ascending to the heights of power, he would continue to look after his brothers, granting them titles and positions, albeit temporarily. Following his time at Brienne, he entered the prestigious military academy in Paris, a pinnacle of opportunity for someone of his background. Yet, in this elite environment, he faced not just teasing, but outright disdain. The French aristocracy regarded him as an anomaly, something exotic and potentially dangerous. Even so, he discovered a powerful weapon in knowledge. He excelled in the sciences, particularly in mathematics and artillery, ultimately graduating at the top of his class. This achievement earned him his first commission as a second lieutenant in an artillery regiment stationed in southern France, where he served in the town of Auxonne. As he wrote essays advocating for the freedom of Corsica, dreaming of returning to liberate his homeland from French rule, his early writings were filled with fervor and anti-French sentiment. However, when he finally returned to Corsica to join the resistance, things did not go as planned. His former idol, Paoli, viewed Napoleon as overly ambitious and unpredictable, leading to a bitter personal conflict that forced him to leave the island for good. Upon his return to France, he was no longer merely a Corsican yearning for independence. He was a man alienated by both his homeland and the country he had once called his own. In that moment of estrangement, he came to realize that he belonged to no nationality but himself. He would not simply be a Frenchman by birth, but one who would earn his place through conquest. By this point, France was on the brink of monumental change. The king still sat on the throne, but the ground beneath him was trembling with unrest. The air was thick with the scent of revolution, offering a pivotal opportunity for a man like Napoleon. The old order was crumbling, and in its wake, a new reality was emerging, one where merit, not lineage, would define success. In the latter half of the 18th century, France was bubbling with discontent beneath the surface of a seemingly stable monarchy. The nation's economy was faltering, its treasury depleted by prolonged wars, including participation in the American Revolution. The burden of taxation fell heavily on the shoulders of the Third Estate, peasants, artisans, and the burgeoning middle class, while the privileged classes of clergy and nobility lived lavishly, untouched by the economic turmoil. This growing resentment towards the aristocracy only fueled the fires of revolution. Amid mounting hunger, inflation, and widespread dissatisfaction, the monarchy under Louis XVI appeared increasingly impotent to address the crisis. Attempts at reform floundered, and the royal court became more disconnected from the struggles of the populace. Enlightenment ideals, once confined to the salons of the elite, began to penetrate the masses, prompting questions about equality, justice, and the role of citizens in shaping their nation's destiny. Ultimately, these simmering tensions erupted into open revolt. The storming of the Bastille became a powerful symbol of this new era. The old order was disintegrating, the king was losing his grip on power, the nobility was losing their lands, and the church was losing its influence. In the midst of this upheaval, a chaotic yet exhilarating republic was being born, where anything seemed possible, both ascension and ruin. For young men like Napoleon Bonaparte, this was a historical opportunity that could not be ignored. At just 20 years old, as the revolution ignited, he found himself an artillery officer without wealth, connections, or noble titles. But in a rapidly changing landscape, these distinctions mattered little. The revolution had opened the door for extraordinary individuals to rise based on talent and ability rather than heritage. Napoleon, with his fierce determination and strategic mind, was poised to seize this moment, ready to carve his name into the annals of history. What if I told you that a 26-year-old general named Napoleon Bonaparte didn't just open doors, but completely demolished the walls of military tradition? How could such a young leader, lacking both noble birth and extensive battle experience, rise to such prominence in a time of chaotic upheaval? And why did an army in desperate need of capable officers rally behind him so fervently? In the year 1796, Bonaparte took command of the French army at a pivotal moment in history. The landscape of Europe was shifting as the nobility fled France, leaving a vacuum of leadership in the military. Bonaparte was a name already whispered in military circles. He had a proven track record, having successfully quelled unrest in Toulon and played a crucial role in suppressing a rebellion in Paris. Yet, it was his ability to think outside the box that would set him apart from his predecessors. From his very first moments in command, Bonaparte made it clear that he was not interested in adhering to the old military conventions. He swiftly reorganized his command structure, brought order to a disarrayed headquarters, and established a supply chain that had been sorely lacking. But perhaps his most revolutionary act was addressing the soldiers not with platitudes about duty or homeland, but with passionate words about glory, victory, and the fertile lands of Italy that awaited them. This resonated deeply with the weary soldiers, igniting a sense of purpose and excitement. They saw not just a leader, but a man willing to lead them to victory and a better life. By April, Bonaparte launched an offensive that was unlike anything the military had seen before. He broke the mold of traditional warfare by refusing to procrastinate or wait for reinforcements. Instead, he struck quickly and decisively. The Austrian and Sardinian forces, caught off guard, were systematically defeated. Bonaparte skillfully picked them apart one by one, disrupting their lines of communication and forcing combat on his own terms. Within mere weeks, the King of Piedmont sought peace, withdrawing Sardinia from the conflict. This marked Bonaparte's first major triumph. As the campaign continued, each battle became a stepping stone to greater fame. The Battle of Lodi was particularly significant, as it bolstered the army's faith in their young general. The Austrians had entrenched themselves behind the Adda River, and the path to their position was narrow, under constant fire from artillery. Undeterred, Bonaparte ordered an assault, bravely leading his grenadiers into the fray. His fearless actions inspired his troops, and they successfully seized the bridge, pushing the enemy back. Later, Bonaparte would reflect that it was at Lodi he realized he could influence not only battles, but history itself. The ensuing Battle of Arcole tested Bonaparte's resolve and the endurance of his troops. The terrain was treacherous, with muddy ground and severed communications between battalions. Yet, Bonaparte managed to unify his forces, leading them into the assault personally. In a moment of desperation, he grabbed the regimental flag and charged across the bridge, even being knocked into the river at one point. His soldiers, witnessing their leader's courage, followed him into battle, resulting in another hard-fought victory. This battle was won not just through numbers, but through the character and determination of the men. The climax of this campaign came during the Battle of Rivoli. The Austrians attempted to break the siege of Mantua, deploying significant forces against Bonaparte's smaller army. However, the French, capitalizing on the strategic advantages of the terrain, occupied commanding heights and flanked the enemy. The battle raged for 2 days, culminating in a decisive defeat for the Austrian forces, with thousands taken prisoner and significant artillery captured. Soon after, Mantua surrendered, placing Italy firmly under French control. But Bonaparte's ambitions extended beyond mere military victories. He sought to reshape the political landscape of the region. In the territories he conquered, he established sister republics, the Cisalpine, Ligurian, and Roman republics. These were formally independent states, inspired by the ideals of liberty and equality, yet essentially functioning as puppets of France, supplying troops, resources, and funds to support the French army. The French forces were sustained by these newly acquired lands, which also became a source for the plunder of art and cultural treasures. Paintings, sculptures, books, and coins were spirited away from Italian museums and monasteries to adorn the future Louvre in Paris. While this was framed as a liberation of culture, many viewed it as systematic looting. As Austria faced defeat after defeat, it found itself on the brink of collapse. Bonaparte advanced toward Vienna, but Paris, alarmed by his rising power, ordered him to halt. Negotiations ensued, and in October 1797, the Treaty of Campo Formio was signed. Austria recognized all French conquests in Italy and ceded territories along the Rhine. This marked the first complete and formally recognized victory for the French Republic since the onset of the Revolutionary Wars. Bonaparte returned to France amid celebrations, having achieved a status that transcended politics. His name resonated even with those indifferent to political matters. He became a hero of the Republic, a symbol of a new era, embodying the resolve to reshape the world. Yet, even as his star shone brightly, danger lurked. The Directory, the governing body of France, viewed Bonaparte with suspicion, seeing him as a potential usurper. Although he was beloved by the people and trusted by the army, they understood that removing him from power could pose significant risks. Their solution was clever. They offered Bonaparte command of an expedition not within Europe, but to the distant land of Egypt. This not only kept him from threatening their authority, but also addressed a crucial foreign policy objective. France could not directly invade England, given the weakness of its navy. Such an engagement would likely result in defeat. However, indirectly striking Britain's interests in India via Egypt was a tantalizing prospect. Egypt, though an official province of the Ottoman Empire, held strategic significance between Europe and India. Controlling Egypt would allow France to disrupt British roots and interests. Seizing the opportunity, Bonaparte embraced this challenge, viewing it as a chance to not only affirm his prowess as a general, but also to establish himself as a statesman capable of shaping a new civilization. In the spring of 1798, Bonaparte's name echoed across France. He was a war hero, the liberator of Italy, a creator of republics, and a general who had never tasted defeat. But fame is a double-edged sword. As he ascended in public favor, so too did the anxiety grow among those in power. The Directory recognized that Bonaparte's popularity could be a threat. Thus, they sent him to lead a colossal expedition to Egypt, far from the political maneuvers of Europe. In May of 1798, a formidable fleet set sail from Toulon, comprising over 300 ships carrying 35,000 soldiers and officers, along with thousands of horses and artillery. Crucially, it also transported 167 scientists, mathematicians, astronomers, architects, geologists, and linguists. This was not merely a military force, it was a mission of enlightenment. Bonaparte envisioned an expedition that would achieve not just military might, but also the spread of knowledge. He established the Institute of Egypt, bringing along printing presses, microscopes, tools, and field laboratories. The first stop was Malta, a strategic island held by the Knights of St. John. With swift military action, Bonaparte forced their capitulation, implemented rapid administrative reforms, abolished the old order, disarmed the clergy, and seized vital supplies. Within a week, the French fleet continued on its course toward Egypt. Malta became merely a prologue, a prelude to the real challenges that lay ahead. As the French army landed in Alexandria on July 1st, they were met with an entirely different landscape. The harsh realities of the Egyptian environment, the relentless heat, swirling sands, swarms of insects, and debilitating diseases, quickly transformed the expedition into a grueling campaign. The initial triumph was overshadowed by the difficulties they would encounter in the weeks and months to come. What if I told you that a young general once transformed from a hero of the Republic into a dictator, all while the world watched in awe? How did Napoleon Bonaparte, the man compared to Julius Caesar, navigate the turmoil of a crumbling regime to seize power? And what role did his enigmatic wife Josephine play in this historical saga? As Bonaparte led his army south across the scorching desert toward Cairo, he hoped to harness the mighty Nile as both a source of life and a strategic advantage. Weeks later, his forces drew closer to the small village of Mbuhute, advancing toward a site that would forever be etched in history as the battlefield near the pyramids. At that time, the Mamluks, a powerful military caste, maintained control over Egypt, yet their grip was weakening. Ongoing scandals, widespread corruption, political intrigue, and inefficiency eroded the remnants of their authority. Generals acted almost autonomously, provinces operated in isolation, and an atmosphere of impending change enveloped the capital. Everyone sensed the old order was crumbling, yet no one could foresee what would rise in its place. It was during this precarious moment that Bonaparte resurfaced, his reputation still fresh in the public mind. He had achieved victories in Italy and at Pyramids, earning the title of the Republic's hero. His return was met with thunderous enthusiasm. Crowds gathered to glimpse his carriage, and newspapers hailed him as the nation's savior. Political maneuvering ensued. Some sought to wield him as a sword, while others hoped to steer his ambitions. However, Bonaparte was no longer the youthful general chasing glory in Italy. He had evolved into a man resolute in his historical mission. The conspiracy unfolded with key figures, including his brother Lucien Bonaparte, the president of the Council of 500, the politically astute CAS aiming to reform the Republic, and the military minister Roger Ducos. Their strategy was straightforward: capitalize on societal discontent and military influence to orchestrate a peaceful coup under the guise of protecting the Constitution. On the 9th of November, 1999, known as the 18th Brumaire in the revolutionary calendar, members of the legislative assemblies convened at a residence in St. Cloud, away from the unrest of Paris. They were informed that a plot against the Republic was afoot, and that, for their safety, the vote needed to occur far from the capital. Everything seemed legal, but beneath the surface lay a calculated scheme. Napoleon arrived at St. Cloud with a contingent of grenadiers. He stepped into the assembly hall, attempting to deliver a speech that fell flat, confused, unconvincing, and disjointed. The deputies awaited clarity, but instead were met with accusations and threats. The noise escalated, shouts erupted in the Council of 500, calling for the end of tyranny. A palpable sense of danger filled the air. One deputy, enraged, attempted to assault Bonaparte, but he was quickly extracted from the hall under guard. The situation was perilous, teetering on the edge of chaos. Then, Lucien took center stage. Climbing the tribune, he drew his sword, brandished it high, and declared that his brother was no conspirator but rather the Republic's savior. He threatened to use the very weapon against Napoleon should he betray the cause of freedom. This dramatic gesture was meticulously calculated. Soldiers stationed outside were ushered into the hall, pushing the deputies aside. The power shift occurred swiftly and without bloodshed, albeit not without intimidation. The following day, a new form of governance was announced: the consulate. Formally, it was a restoration of order, establishing a government comprised of 3 consuls, with Bonaparte designated as the first among equals. However, it became clear from the onset that equality was an illusion. The other 2 consuls, CAS and Ducos, soon became secondary figures in this new regime. Bonaparte assumed control of all significant decisions, dismantling the revolutionary parliamentary system, dissolving the Council of 500, and replacing it with a Senate more compliant to his will. He reasserted control over the military and initiated sweeping administrative reforms. France was not moving toward anarchy, but rather toward centralization. The populace, exhausted by disorder, accepted these changes without resistance. In fact, many viewed Bonaparte's ascent as liberation from chaos. Newspapers depicted him as a capable leader poised to conclude the revolution. He embodied a blend of the Republican struggle, military glory, and promises of order. Bonaparte maintained the conquests of the revolution, preserving the civil code, freedom of conscience, and educational reforms. Yet, under his rule, old freedoms began to wane. The narrative shifted from one of popular sovereignty to a focus on stability, discipline, and the greatness of the state. While he retained the title of First Consul, he effectively became the ruler of France. His offices crafted laws, his signature sanctioned appointments, his will guided the nation's fate. Thus, the era of revolutionary disorder came to a close, giving way to a new chapter, an era dominated by one man. He did not yet crown himself, but he wielded the nation's authority. The initial years following the coup of the 18th Brumaire marked a period of surprising calm for France after a decade of revolution, terror, civil conflict, and political experimentation. For the first time in many years, order returned to the country. The new leader acted decisively and swiftly, instilling discipline not only in the military, but also within governmental institutions. Bonaparte focused on restoring control, reforming the administration, establishing a clear hierarchy of power, appointing prefects in the departments, and reviving the funding of the judicial system. In the year 2000, the Bank of France was established, paving the way for financial stabilization. Taxes were unified, consistent measures of weight and length were instituted, and the first significant codifications of law began to take shape. Every action was driven by a singular logic: order, efficiency, and centralized oversight. He did not dismantle the revolution's achievements. Rather, he solidified them, integrating them into a new, rational framework. The freedom of religious practice, secular education, the abolition of feudal privileges, and equality before the law were preserved, not as ideals, but as structural components of governance. The conversation no longer revolved around popular sovereignty, but rather revolved around the necessity of a strong authority to prevent the country from disintegrating. In the year 2002, as the populace grew accustomed to the new order, a plebiscite was held. The question was straightforward: should Napoleon Bonaparte be appointed as the lifelong consul? The official results revealed overwhelming consensus. The outcome of the plebiscite surprised few and bore little significance. The real crux lay in another realization. France had ceased to resist personal power. On the contrary, it craved it. Amidst this backdrop, the concept of restoring a monarchy, albeit in a new guise, no longer seemed radical. Bonaparte had no intention of becoming the King of France. That would be a regression to a past he had fought against. He sought something different: a new title, a fresh identity, a novel system. France needed not a dynasty, but a founder. Thus, in the year 2004, the decision was made. Napoleon would become the Emperor of the French. While preparations unfolded, a personal narrative continued in the shadows of these monumental events. The story of his wife, Josephine de Beauharnais, the woman who stood by his side from the very beginning. 6 years his senior, she hailed from Martinique, having survived the execution of her first husband by guillotine. With 2 children to raise and a reputation for grace in Parisian society, Josephine was both respected and admired. When they met in 1895, she was already a socialite, known for her intelligence and charm. Napoleon fell for her with breathtaking intensity, his letters filled with passion and longing, revealing a depth of emotion beneath his composed exterior. They married in the spring of 1996, just days before he departed for Italy. It was a spontaneous union, born from his quest for love and her need for protection. Although their relationship began amidst jealousy, hurt, and conflict, they remained together, navigating the tumultuous waters of both personal and political life. Josephine accompanied him in public life, standing by him during crucial moments as their intertwined fates unfolded against the backdrop of history. What if I told you that one man was capable of reshaping an entire continent, effortlessly turning enemies into allies? How did Napoleon Bonaparte, a seemingly ordinary military leader, manage to command such influence? And what role did his wife Josephine play in this grand transformation? As he ascended to the position of the first consul, Napoleon not only solidified Josephine's status in his life, but also ensured her presence at monumental events such as his coronation. This choice was more than a personal gesture. It was a powerful statement that resonated throughout a Europe on the brink of change. On the 2nd of December in 1804, Napoleon made a pivotal decision. He shifted his focus from ambitious naval invasions to the heart of Germany. The speed with which he altered his military strategy astonished even the most seasoned generals of the time. Within mere weeks, he orchestrated the crossing of the Rhine River by an army exceeding 200,000 men, known as the Grande Armée. They maneuvered along a meticulously calculated route, deliberately avoiding confrontation until they achieved decisive superiority. His primary objective was to dismantle the Austrian army before Russian reinforcements could arrive. General Karl Mack, commanding the Austrian forces, concentrated his troops around the city of Ulm, confident that the French would not be able to reach him in time. He aimed to hold his ground and await the arrival of his allies. However, Napoleon had other plans. Instead of a direct assault, he executed a series of calculated maneuvers, outflanking the Austrians from the north, crossing the Danube River, and ultimately encircling them. Ulm fell into a trap. The Austrian troops, desperate to break free, were intercepted at every turn. On the 20th of October in 1805, after several days of fruitless attempts to escape, General Mack surrendered, resulting in the capture of over 25,000 soldiers. This victory was achieved without any major dissent from his generals, highlighting the effectiveness of speed, precision, and strategic brilliance. After Ulm, the path to Vienna lay wide open. Napoleon triumphantly entered the Austrian capital in November. Yet, the war was far from over. The main forces of the Allies, comprising the Russian army under the command of General Kutuzov and Tsar Alexander I, along with the remnants of the Austrians, were retreating towards Moravia. Napoleon recognized the dire state of his army, stretched thin and worn out. The longer the conflict dragged on, the higher the risk of Prussia intervening or rebellion erupting in his rear. He understood that he needed to deliver a decisive blow. Choosing the plateau near the town of Austerlitz as the battlefield, he lured the Allies into a confrontation. To set the stage for his strategy, Napoleon orchestrated a brilliant military deception. He deliberately weakened his right flank, withdrawing certain troops to create the illusion that his forces were unable to hold their position. This was a trap. On the morning of the 2nd of December in 1805, precisely on the anniversary of his coronation, the battle commenced amidst a shroud of morning mist. The Russo-Austrian forces launched their attack on the French right flank, precisely where Napoleon wanted them to engage. As their main forces became entrenched in their offensive, he launched a sudden counterattack at the center. French corps surged onto the Pratzen Heights, effectively splitting the Allied army in two. From that moment onward, the battle unfolded with relentless speed. The central forces of the Allies were encircled and routed, while their flanks fell into disarray. French artillery mercilessly bombarded the retreating troops. At the ponds of Satschan, the Allied forces attempted to cross on fragile ice that began to crack under the thunderous roar of cannon fire. Hundreds of soldiers plunged into the icy waters, while vehicles sank and the remnants of order collapsed. By evening, the outcome was clear. The Allies suffered over 30,000 casualties, including dead, wounded, and captured. In contrast, French losses were significantly lower. Tsar Alexander I hastily retreated, stunned and disillusioned, while Emperor Francis II found himself isolated and ultimately prohibited any peace negotiations. The Treaty of Pressburg, signed in December, solidified the political ramifications of this triumph. Austria exited the coalition, relinquished claims to Italy and Germany, paid reparations, and ceded substantial territory. France established itself definitively as a dominant power in Europe. But Napoleon's ambitions did not stop at peace. He envisioned a transformed map of Germany. The following year, under French protection, the Confederation of the Rhine was formed, uniting 16 German states that had seceded from the Holy Roman Empire. This marked the de facto end of an empire that had endured for nearly a millennium. Francis II abandoned his title as Emperor of the Germans, and the old order based on vassal loyalty was irrevocably shattered. From this moment forward, the landscape of Europe would no longer adhere to traditional borders. The map was redrawn in the war rooms of the French army, enacted through imperial edicts, and sealed with the signatures of the defeated. The Battle of Austerlitz was not merely a military victory. It reinforced Napoleon's image as a man capable of redefining the world through both military might and political acumen. His empire was no longer perceived as a fleeting anomaly, but had become a new reality, an object of admiration for some and a source of fear for others. Following the defeat of the Third Coalition, the events at Austerlitz, and the establishment of the Confederation of the Rhine, France entered a new phase of existence, a phase of consolidation and institutionalization of power. The victory in war afforded the empire political supremacy, yet Napoleon understood the need for his authority to resonate beyond the battlefield and into the daily lives of millions. During this era, the empire attained its highest level of internal stability. All key mechanisms of governance were set in motion. The army remained combat-ready, the finances stable, and the populace, for the most part, loyal. However, beneath this external tranquility lay meticulous efforts to transform revolutionary chaos into a centralized monarchy under a single will. The primary tool for this transformation consisted of administrative reforms initiated during the consulate, but fully realized during the empire. France was divided into departments, each overseen by a prefect appointed directly from Paris. These prefects were not elected. They did not answer to local elites, but rather executed the will of the central authority. They controlled tax collection, school oversight, policing, infrastructure, and public order. Beneath them, sub-prefects, mayors, and councillors were similarly appointed rather than elected. The democratic elements that the revolution had sought to preserve were completely dismantled. Power no longer emanated from the grassroots. It flowed from above, in a clear, sequential manner, without room for discussion. To support this new structure, a unified legal foundation was essential. This is where the Napoleonic Code emerged as one of the most significant legal projects in Western jurisprudence. Development began during the consulate, but culminated in publication in 1804, subsequently receiving numerous amendments and clarifications. This was not just a compilation of laws. It represented a political manifesto. The Code enshrined principles of equality before the law, the inviolability of property, freedom of contract, secular marriage, and civil liability. It abolished class distinctions, erased birth privileges, and systematized judicial practices. It granted men authority within the family, while the state took control of civil matters. According to the Code, women were subservient to their husbands, divorce was restricted, and paternal authority became absolute. From a legal perspective, this was a monumental leap forward. Politically, it served as a tool for legitimization. Now, the empire had an official legal basis, clear, rational, and consistent from Lille to Marseille. The Code was also exported to dependent states, reaching Italy and Belgium, and thus began to alter the very fabric of European governance and society. Napoleon's vision of a new order was being systematically realized, reshaping not just territories, but the very essence of law and authority throughout the continent. What does it take to reshape an entire continent? How does one man's ambition lead to the rise and fall of empires? Napoleon Bonaparte, a name synonymous with military genius and imperial grandeur, is at the heart of this story. As he maneuvered through the treacherous waters of European politics and warfare, he faced both triumph and tragedy. But the question remains, was the glory of conquest worth the cost? In the early 19th century, Napoleon transformed France into a formidable empire, adopting a model of civilization that was secular, centralized, and legally formalized. Yet, he understood that stability relied heavily on powerful symbols. To replace the burnt and exiled aristocracy of the old regime, he needed to craft a new elite. Thus, in 1808, he established the imperial nobility. This was not a return to bloodline aristocracy, rather, it was a merit-based nobility. Generals, judges, administrators, scholars, and devoted officials were elevated to the status of counts, barons, viscounts, and dukes, rewarded for their loyalty and service to the state. As Napoleon's forces surged through Europe, two pivotal battles unfolded almost simultaneously: the battles of Jena and Auerstedt. At Jena, Napoleon himself commanded the army against the elderly and indecisive Duke of Brunswick. The French launched their attack at dawn, and throughout the day the tide of battle ebbed and flowed. By noon, however, Napoleon committed his reserves, and the Prussian line crumbled. What began as a retreat quickly devolved into a rout. Meanwhile, at Auerstedt, Marshal Davout faced a daunting task, leading a mere 26,000 men against a Prussian army exceeding 60,000. Against all odds, discipline, artillery fire, and the tenacity of the French infantry secured an astounding victory. The once mighty Prussian forces faltered and fled, leaving the battlefield to Davout, who Napoleon rightfully later named Duke of Auerstedt. By evening, it became clear. Prussia had been decisively defeated in just a single day. Napoleon pressed onwards, soon entering Berlin. For several weeks he imposed a new order upon the city. Arsenal facilities were confiscated, and key infrastructure such as bridges and roads fell under French control. French soldiers occupied barracks, museums, and palaces. What was once the heart of Prussian spirit had morphed into a staging ground for Napoleon's future campaigns. Yet it was in Berlin that Napoleon undertook one of his most significant political and economic maneuvers: the Berlin Decree, signed in late October of 1806. This decree announced a complete economic blockade against Great Britain. All ports under the control of the French Empire and its allies were to shut their doors to British ships, rendering trade with England illegal. A rigorous surveillance system was established to monitor goods transported by sea. British merchandise was subject to confiscation, and vessels were to be seized. Even neutral countries were faced with a stark choice: trade with France or with London. This marked the beginning of the so-called Continental Blockade, a grand economic campaign aimed at suffocating Britain. While Napoleon could not defeat the British at sea, he hoped to dismantle their trading empire by cutting off access to European markets. On paper, the blockade appeared both powerful and unyielding. In practice, it required immense effort, establishing a customs service, monitoring coastlines, tracking merchants and diplomats, imposing sanctions, and executing repressive measures against violators. Some nations resisted, while others, like Russia, nominally complied but circumstantially circumvented the ban through neutral intermediaries. The black market thrived, yet the gesture itself carried monumental symbolic weight. Napoleon was not merely confronting an army, he was challenging a vast trading network and the global economy itself. As the blockade took shape, Napoleon continued his military campaign. The remnants of the Prussian army withdrew eastward, its pride shattered. Russian forces were already advancing, and the war against Prussia was quietly melding into a conflict with Russia. A new chapter of warfare was about to unfold, one that promised to be even more arduous and bloody. By winter of 1806, France found itself entrenched in the heart of northern Europe. Pomerania lay beaten, its capital occupied, its army shattered, and its king in flight. However, Napoleon's triumph was incomplete. His principal rival, the very reason for the formation of the Fourth Coalition, had yet to engage. Russia, driven by Tsar Alexander I's desire to halt the spread of Napoleon's empire, was amassing troops in territories that once belonged to Poland. The impending winter campaign loomed ominously on the horizon. Despite the fatigue endured by his forces after the battles of Jena and the rapid marches through Saxony, Napoleon was unwilling to bide his time until spring. He was determined to strike before the Russians could solidify their positions. By the dawn of 1807, French troops advanced northeastward, only to encounter their first significant clash at the Battle of Eylau in early February. Here, Marshal Bennigsen commanded the Russian forces, and as the two armies met, the conditions were less than favorable. Snow and blizzards obscured movement and visibility. The Battle of Eylau, fought from the 7th to the 8th of February, 1807, turned into one of the most harrowing experiences of Napoleon's career. The initial chaos saw the French attempting to breach the Russian defenses, but meeting fierce resistance. Artillery became trapped in snowdrifts, and cavalry charges yielded little result. Each village and hill became a battleground, with heavy losses on both sides. By the end of the first day, Napoleon realized that a decisive breakthrough was elusive. As night fell, temperatures plummeted further. French soldiers huddled together on the ground, some freezing to death in the bitter cold. The following morning, the French army was exhausted. Yet they were unexpectedly bolstered by the arrival of Marshal Davout's corps from the south. This allowed Napoleon to launch a second wave of assaults, but despite their relentless efforts, the Russian army was not defeated. They retreated in an organized manner, leaving the battlefield intact, yet still capable of engaging in combat. The casualties were staggering, over 20,000 dead, wounded, or missing from each side. The snow itself bore witness to the bloodshed, turning black and crimson. Even Napoleon, a master of glorifying victories, refrained from celebrating this one. For the first time, he had not achieved an unqualified triumph, and perhaps it was here that he truly grasped the nature of war in the East. It would be different. As spring approached in 1807, hostilities resumed. The Russian army had fortified its positions anew, but the French faced significant hurdles. Roads were destroyed, supply lines were unstable, and soldiers fell ill. Yet, despite these monumental obstacles, Napoleon remained resolute and proactive. He understood that if he could shatter the Russian forces before any other powers, such as Prussia or Sweden, could intervene, he might not only conclude this campaign, but also change the landscape of Europe forever. What happens when confidence turns into catastrophe? How did the mighty Napoleon face a relentless uprising that would shake the very foundations of his empire? And what drove a man, once a revolutionary, to choose political expediency over love? These questions linger as we delve into the dramatic events of the early 19th century, where the fate of nations hung in the balance. The year was 1807. A pivotal moment in history unfolded at the Battle of Friedland on June 14th. Russian forces, bolstered by their sheer numbers and indomitable spirit, opted to take the offensive. General Bennigsen aimed to seize the initiative, yet he made a grave strategic blunder by positioning his army with a river at their back, a move that would have catastrophic consequences in the event of defeat. Napoleon, ever the keen strategist, quickly recognized the vulnerabilities of his opponent. He chose to engage in battle on terms he had meticulously crafted. The French artillery systematically bombarded the Russian positions, while infantry advanced in waves and cavalry cut off any possible escape routes. By midday, Bennigsen's army was in disarray, retreating toward the bridges over the Allies River. In the chaos, panic ensued. The wooden crossings buckled under the weight, and the rushing waters claimed lives, horses, and supplies alike. Meanwhile, back in the Spanish capital, Madrid erupted in revolt. Crowds of enraged citizens launched assaults on French garrisons, executing officers and setting barracks ablaze. In response, Marshal Murat, who commanded the army in Spain, issued orders for ruthless suppression. The streets ran red with blood. Public executions became commonplace, and prisoners were shot without mercy. This unprecedented brutality marked a dark chapter, as the French army unleashed its fury upon the civilian population. However, the insurrection in Madrid was merely the spark that ignited a broader conflagration. News of the uprising spread like wildfire across Spain, with revolts erupting in Zaragoza, Valencia, and Seville. A grassroots movement emerged as not just soldiers but ordinary Spaniards, farmers, tradesmen, monks, and even former soldiers, took up arms to defend their homeland. The French found themselves embroiled not in a conventional war against a standing army, but in a novel type of guerrilla warfare that was chaotic yet remarkably effective. French soldiers, trained to confront organized armies, faced an unfamiliar enemy. The adversaries could be anyone: a beggar on the road, a merchant in a village, or a boy wielding a rifle in the woods. Ambushes became commonplace, convoys were raided, and bridges were blown up. Each advance required protection and reconnaissance, as the army navigated through territories where every day could be their last. Joseph Bonaparte, who had entered Madrid, soon found himself trapped like a rat in a besieged fortress. Beyond the city, he controlled nearly nothing. Despite their skills, French generals were rendered powerless against the tide of popular resistance. Even in their victories at places like Acaña or Mytilene, the aftermath did not yield stability. As they retreated, they left behind a void that was rapidly filled by insurgents. The pattern repeated itself from town to town and village to village. The French forces were not just battling an army, they were contending with the very land itself. In the mountains of Cantabria, the forests of Asturias, and the plains of Extremadura, the enemy was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. As the situation deteriorated further, British troops landed to aid the Spanish insurgents, led by General Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington. His army, though small, was disciplined and effective. They arrived at various ports, coordinated with the rebels, and organized the logistics necessary for their campaign. With each passing month, the French found it increasingly difficult to maintain control. Spain transformed into a black hole for the empire. Napoleon was compelled to redirect troops from other fronts to reinforce his beleaguered forces in Spain. In late 1808, he personally traveled to Spain to take command of the situation. He secured a few victories, crushing enemy forces at Espinosa and Somosierra, and even regained full control of Madrid. Yet, these victories came at an ever-increasing cost, and the overall situation remained dire. Back in France, the internal resistance began to mount. Soldiers returned home in coffins, and Spain became a symbol of a fruitless and unending war. For the first time in years, Napoleon found himself having to justify this conflict to his people. Why was this war being waged? What was the rationale behind placing his brother on the throne of a nation that despised France? And what was the way forward? Heroes emerged not only from the ranks of the empire. Spanish leaders like General Castaños, Father Mendizabal, and guerrilla leader Juan Martín became national icons. Artists, writers, and folk songs began to echo the themes of liberation rather than capitulation. By 1810, the war raged on with no end in sight. Spain neither fell nor triumphed. France did not lose, yet it failed to exert control. This marked the first fissure in the empire's structure, an invisible yet deeply threatening crack. Spain demonstrated that even the most formidable army in Europe could be rendered powerless when an entire nation rises in resistance. As 1812 dawned, France still presented the facade of a powerful empire, the likes of which Europe had not seen since the time of Charlemagne. Territories under Napoleon's command or his vassal states stretched from the Atlantic to the Vistula, from the Baltic Sea to Naples. The French code governed Warsaw and Vienna, while his brothers, marshals, and trusted officials held sway in palaces across Europe. In Paris, an air of splendor permeated the streets, with parades, balls, architecture, newspapers, and military marches creating a dazzling display. On the surface, the empire appeared invulnerable. Yet, beneath it all, tensions brewed. The economy strained under the weight of the continental blockade, a strategy Napoleon had imposed on the continent to stifle British trade. Smuggling surged, prices fluctuated wildly, and rulers grumbled. The army increasingly relied on conscripts, many of whom had to be coerced into service. In Spain, the bloody and futile war dragged on. Discontent simmered in the north, where the Dutch grew restless, while the Germans grappled with the burdens of taxes and poverty. Even Napoleon, despite his seemingly unshakable position, felt the need to reinforce his grip on power. By 1810, he had long ceased to be a revolutionary figure. He had transformed into an emperor in the classical sense, preoccupied with legacy and legitimacy. It was from this perspective that he made one of the most dramatic decisions of his life. He chose to divorce Josephine. Josephine de Beauharnais, his first wife, was the woman he had passionately loved. However, she had been unable to provide him with an heir. Napoleon had postponed this decision, clinging to hope that physicians were mistaken. Yet, by 1809, it became apparent that if he wished for his empire to endure beyond his reign, he must have a son. In December of that year, he announced the divorce at court. This was not merely a tragedy of love, but an act of political will. He did not leave Josephine destitute, but he completely severed their bond. Shortly thereafter, he entered into a new marriage with Maria Louisa, the daughter of the Emperor of Austria. This alliance was a strategic move towards gaining recognition, elevating him to the status of equals among Europe's established dynasties. In 1811, they welcomed a son, Napoleon II. For Napoleon, this newborn signified the establishment of a new dynasty and a new world in which he would no longer be viewed as an usurper, but as a legitimate emperor. Yet at this moment of triumph, as his power seemed consolidated, the cracks in his alliances began to deepen. Austria, bound to him by marriage, remained distant and cold, while Prussia began to unravel under the weight of its obligations. The empire that once seemed invincible was beginning to show signs of vulnerability, setting the stage for the tumultuous events that would follow. What happens when an empire's ambitions clash with the stark realities of war? What drove the once mighty Napoleon Bonaparte to the brink of disaster? How did Alexander I, once a mere ally, become a key player in the downfall of the French Empire? This is the tale of great power struggles, shifting alliances, and the inexorable march of history that led to the dramatic events of the early 19th century. As the British fleet reigned supreme over the seas, trade began to collapse, creating tumultuous unrest in Italy and casting dark shadows over Europe. The most vital shift, however, occurred in Russia, where the relationship between Napoleon and Alexander I began to unravel. What had been a partnership, however tenuous, now crumbled under the strain of conflict. With Russia feeling humiliated and the continental blockade choking its economy, the winds of change blew fiercely against Napoleon's ambitions. The Russian nobility, particularly the merchants of the northern regions, recognized the necessity of maintaining trade with England, rendering the alliance with France increasingly pointless. Meanwhile, the creation of the Duchy of Warsaw by Napoleon, encroaching on former Polish territories, sent ripples of anxiety through St. Petersburg. For Russia, the growing strength of this duchy represented a direct and intolerable threat. By the year 1811, diplomatic relations had soured significantly, reaching a boiling point by spring of 1812. In a calculated move, Napoleon decided to strike first, assembling what would become known as the Grande Armée, a titanic force that was the largest ever seen on the continent, boasting over 600,000 men from diverse backgrounds: French, Polish, Italian, German, Dutch, and Austrian soldiers. This was not merely a military campaign, it was a bold display of imperial might, as Napoleon aimed to preemptively diminish the brewing coalition against him. As spring unfolded in 1813, the French army crossed the Rhine once more. But the landscape had shifted dramatically. No longer did they face only Russia. They were now confronted by an alliance that included former vassals, namely Prussia and Sweden, both of which had recently shaken off the yoke of French domination. The Swedish crown prince had become Bernadotte, a former marshal of France now leading forces against his former sovereign. Austria, while maintaining a facade of neutrality, was carefully observing the tumultuous events, poised to make a decisive choice. In the early skirmishes in Saxony, the French army achieved several defensive victories, notably at Lutzen and Bautzen. However, these victories proved hollow, as they did not translate into the strategic breakthroughs Napoleon desperately needed. As negotiations for peace commenced, the discord between the coalition's demands and Napoleon's firm resolve became glaringly apparent. The coalition sought a return to France's borders of 1791, demanding the relinquishment of territories in Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands. For Napoleon, conceding to such terms would equate to the dismantling of his empire. By the summer of 1813, hostilities resumed with renewed vigor. Austria, despite its familial ties to Napoleon through his wife Maria Louise, daughter of the Austrian emperor, opted to ally with the coalition. The French found themselves increasingly isolated. To the east were the Russians, to the south the Austrians, and to the north, and in Spain, British troops under the command of the Duke of Wellington. The very heart of Germany began to resonate with nationalistic fervor. Once subdued populations rose against their French oppressors. Universities, student unions, and clandestine organizations ignited passions for liberation from the French grip, leading to civil unrest across German cities. The French garrisons, once viewed as liberators, now felt the heavy burden of occupation. By autumn, the inevitability of a decisive clash grew undeniable. That confrontation unfolded in October at Leipzig, a city strategically positioned at the crossroads of crucial trade routes and rivers. On one side stood Napoleon's army, numbering around 200,000 weary yet formidable troops. Opposing them was the united force of the Sixth Coalition, an overwhelming assembly of nearly 350,000 soldiers, comprising Russians, Austrians, Swedes, and reserve corps from Saxony and Bavaria. The Battle of Leipzig, known as the Battle of Nations, raged for 4 harrowing days. The first day saw the French holding their ground, but as each day passed, the coalition strengthened its resolve, continuously bolstering their ranks. By the third day, a full-scale assault commenced. Lacking the resources to maintain their front, Napoleon ordered a retreat. As night fell on the 19th of October, the crossing over the Elster River began. Yet, in a tragic twist of fate, a bridge was detonated prematurely, leaving thousands of soldiers stranded, cut off from their comrades. Many lost their lives, either captured or drowned in the turbulent waters. Among the fallen was Marshal Poniatowski, the only Polish marshal in Napoleon's ranks, who perished in a desperate attempt to swim to safety. The aftermath of the Battle of Leipzig showed staggering losses, with casualties exceeding 100,000 on both sides. More significantly, this battle marked a pivotal turning point. The French army did not merely retreat from the battlefield, they found themselves retreating from Central Europe altogether. Over the winter, Napoleon's grip on Germany slipped away, with Bavaria, Saxony, and the Rhineland, once loyal allies, defecting to the coalition's side. Revolts erupted in the Netherlands, and anti-French factions emerged in Switzerland. Prusse liberated Berlin, Austria reclaimed Vienna, and even in Italy, the French administrative structure began to crumble under local pressure. As winter faded into early 1814, coalition armies crossed into French territory. Alexander I, Blücher, and Schwarzenberg converged towards Paris from multiple fronts. In this seemingly terminal moment for Napoleon's empire, he displayed remarkable military acumen, executing a campaign against the Sixth Coalition within France with his characteristic agility. Maneuvering deftly between enemy columns, he inflicted targeted strikes on enemy forces, achieving notable victories at Trasimene, Montmirail, and Châtillon. These became his last military triumphs, as his outnumbered forces struck with surgical precision. His officers and guards rallied behind him, reminiscent of glorious days gone by, as he entertained the hope of achieving yet another miraculous turnaround. However, that miracle eluded him. The coalition forces were nearing Paris, while Napoleon's armies were groaning under the strain of conflict. Mobilizations no longer provided the boost they once did. Soldiers were exhausted, and the economy lay in ruins. The French Parliament openly debated the possibility of removing the emperor from power. Conversations about the return of the Bourbons, France's former royal dynasty, began to circulate in political circles once again. On the 31st of March, 1814, the coalition armies entered Paris. This was a shocking moment for a city that had grown accustomed to victory parades, now surrendering to foreign troops. Alexander I made a solemn entrance, devoid of gloating, declaring his intent was not vengeance, but a quest for peace. Meanwhile, at Fontainebleau, where Napoleon was sequestered, a heavy silence prevailed. Generals visited him one by one, urging him to abdicate. The populace remained indifferent, unwilling to rise in his defense. After 2 agonizing weeks of deliberation, on the 6th of April, Napoleon formally abdicated the throne. Initially, he resigned in favor of his son, but the Allies dismissed this claim. Ultimately, he signed a full abdication, allowed to retain his title of emperor, not over France, but over the small island of Elba, a mere speck of land off the Tuscan coast. There, he was granted a personal guard, a small entourage, and the semblance of authority. On the 11th of April, Napoleon bid farewell to his guards on the stone steps of Fontainebleau. He embraced his old soldiers, gazing deeply into their eyes, expressing gratitude for their loyalty. "I thank you, soldiers," he said. "I have marched to glory with you, and now I depart. Go forth with pride, for your name shall echo through the ages." Thus concluded the era of the First Empire, but not the saga of Napoleon Bonaparte, for he was not a man who could easily resign himself to defeat, always searching for a flicker of hope, a single possibility for resurgence. What happens when a man who changed the course of European history is exiled to a tiny island? Can a fallen emperor rise from the shadows of obscurity and reclaim his legacy? What drove Napoleon Bonaparte to dictate his memoirs from his lonely prison on St. Helena, and how did he manage to reshape how he would be remembered? In the spring of 1814, as Napoleon Bonaparte found himself exiled on the remote island of Elba, Europe breathed a collective sigh of relief. After years of unrelenting warfare, peace seemed to have returned. The French Empire, having been toppled, was now under the rule of the Bourbon dynasty, with King Louis XVIII taking the throne. In the grand halls of the Congress of Vienna, monarchs and diplomats gathered beneath chandeliers, dividing the continent as if it had not been rattled by the incessant sounds of French drums. But beneath this seemingly tranquil surface lay a dark, looming shadow. Napoleon was alive. As long as he drew breath, the world would not feel secure. On Elba, Napoleon was not merely a prisoner, he was a ruler, albeit of a miniature domain. Granted the title of emperor, he was provided with a small retinue, a personal guard, and a few cannons. He traversed the island, inspecting bridges and fields, gazing out over the restless sea. His energy, restless even in exile, found a creative outlet in the minutiae of governance. He established new regulations, penned letters, and sought to impose order on his small realm. However, his thoughts were persistently drawn to France. During his absence, the nation had fundamentally changed. Louis XVIII aimed to be a monarch of reconciliation, yet a gaping chasm opened up between him and the populace. Many officers of the empire were sidelined, and veterans felt abandoned amidst the shifting tides of history. As Napoleon contemplated the horizon, a moment of solemnity washed over him. When his ship crossed the equator, the soldiers on board celebrated with traditional maritime rituals, but he refrained from joining them. For him, it was not merely a voyage, it was a funeral procession, a haunting reminder of his impending fate. The island of St. Helena, destined to be the final resting place for this once mighty leader, matched the British perception of its bleakness, harsh, isolated, and cold. Jagged cliffs, relentless winds, and an expansive ocean surrounded a lonely garrison. He arrived there in October of 1815, and soon settled into the Longwood estate, a somber, wind-swept residence perched on a hill where not a single ship could be seen on the horizon. It felt less like a home and more like a prison without bars, an escape rendered impossible by the geography that confined him. Accompanying him were only a few loyal individuals, faithful officers, servants, and physicians. Among them were General Bertrand, Marshal Gourgaud, and Count Las Cases, who would become both his confidant and chronicler during these years. In long evenings, as the wind howled outside, Napoleon dictated his memories to Las Cases. He spoke of Egypt, Toulon, Marengo, and Austerlitz, his words weaving through battlefields and past victories like threads in a tapestry. He reflected on former campaigns, dissected defeats, justified his choices, and engaged in a dialogue not with adversaries, but with history itself. These narratives would ultimately form the foundation of his renowned memoirs from St. Helena. Through this exercise, Napoleon sought to reinvent his identity, not just as a general, but as a figure of destiny. He spoke not as an exile, but as a prophet, determined to shape how he would be remembered. This became his final battle, a struggle for his legacy, and he was resolute in his desire to emerge victorious. Yet as the years passed, the toll of his situation weighed heavily upon him. The damp climate, mounting stress, poor nutrition, and conflicts with the new British governor, Hudson Lowe, who scrutinized his every move, took a significant toll on his health. He began to experience debilitating pains, insomnia, waves of exhaustion, and growing irritability. In his letters, he increasingly lamented his solitude, feeling betrayed by Europe and the injustice of his fate. Books became his refuge. He read extensively, immersing himself in the works of Cicero, Livy, and Plutarch. He spent hours in the garden, wandering slowly through the foliage, or, on rainy days, simply gazing out the window at the gray mist that enveloped the island. Despite his isolation, he remained acutely aware of the political landscape. He received old newspapers and engaged in discussions about the situation in France, forecasting potential revolutions. Trapped in memories of the past, he nonetheless contemplated the future. By the spring of 1821, his health took a sharp decline. Doctors suspected he was suffering from stomach cancer, the same illness that had claimed his father's life. The symptoms were excruciating. He lost weight, battled fevers, and struggled to eat. In his final weeks, he lay mostly in bed, unable to rise. The strength that once fueled his dictations and strolls had deserted him. On the 5th of May, 1821, in the afternoon, he requested that someone read his will. In it, he expressed a wish to be buried on the banks of the Seine, close to the French people he had always claimed to love. As evening approached, he lost consciousness, and his last words, according to those present, were, "France, Army, Vanguard, Josephine." He passed away far from his homeland, shrouded in obscurity, without glory, without crowds, and without flags. His body was placed in a modest coffin and interred beneath a willow tree in a tranquil spot devoid of monuments or epitaphs. No name marked his grave, only the words, "Here rest." But this peace would not endure. 2 decades later, in 1840, France negotiated with England to reclaim Napoleon's remains. In Paris, millions turned out to welcome him back. A funeral barge floated down the Seine, draped in mourning, as the streets were lined with flags and weeping crowds. Boys donned military uniforms, and the elderly reminisced about past campaigns. His remains found their final resting place at Les Invalides, encased within an enormous crypt beneath a dome that seemed to bow before his legacy. Thus concluded the journey of a man who began as an obscure artillery officer from Corsica and transformed into a symbol of one of the most tumultuous eras in European history. He was loved, feared, and reviled, yet impossible to forget. For, as was once said of him, he was not merely a man, he was an era, battling against the relentless march of eternity. He lived a mere 51 years, a shorter span than many rulers, less than most generals. Yet in those years, he compressed the essence of what would take others lifetimes to achieve. He rose with breathtaking speed and fell with overwhelming force. He was a student of artillery and the master of Europe, an outcast and a lawmaker, a dictator and a reformer. Within him coexisted brutality and brilliance, cold calculation and a fervent belief in destiny. He left behind no enduring dynasty, no stable system, nor a tranquil legacy. Instead, he bequeathed an era. After him, nothing would ever be the same. Warfare evolved, politics transformed, and Europe itself was irrevocably changed. He dismantled the old order, but from its ruins, he sowed new ideas: equality before the law, civil liberties, and the right to merit. Centuries have passed since his demise, yet the debate surrounding his legacy continues. For some, he is a despotic usurper; for others, a genius and a hero. To all, he remains an enigma, a figure worthy of revisiting time and time again. Empires may crumble, monuments may decay, yet the story told from the first-person perspective, the tale of a man who dared to challenge the world, endures.